There you go. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It's great to see so many people here, and I think that the topic is extremely important. And today I'm going to link the work that we've been doing in nutrition more broadly to something that we're calling the Human Capital Project. And it's well, let me explain it over the next 30 minutes or so. We're very happy to support CGIAR and also IFPRI. We're also very grateful to Kenan and the Forman family, and also very happy to see Alan Berg here. And I'll talk a little more about him later, but he was such a pioneer at the World Bank Group. In 1986, in a United Nations report, Martin Forman wrote that everyone who's interested in food aid should be concerned not just with finding answers to the questions raised, but also with finding answers based on objective evidence rather than on emotion and generalities. Now, this is so important because the food and famine and hunger is an emotional topic. And what's most remarkable about it was in 1986. Now, I started my medical training in 1982, but I started my internship in around the early 1990s. And while you hear a lot about evidence-based medicine now, back in 1986, the evidence-based medicine movement was just starting. And this notion that how you treat a patient should be based on evidence was in its early stages. And so Martin was very much ahead of his time in calling for an evidence base. Now, I want to mention Alan, because Alan, and he didn't know this until I met him just a few minutes ago, had a huge impact on my own career. Because this book, The Nutrition Factor, was one of the textbooks for the very first course I've ever taken in development. It was at Brown University when I was a junior. It was Peter Evans who taught a development economics course, and this was one of the primary textbooks. And so if we read what he'd written, the new interest in nutrition is mixed with curiosity, and the intention devoted to it is often mixed with skepticism. Interest rarely has been translated at the operating level into action. Partly this reflects the traditional view of malnutrition as welfare rather than as a development problem. Now, some of you may know that in 1994, I was part of a movement called 50 Years is Enough, in which we argued vociferously that on their 50th anniversary, that the World Bank and the IMF should be closed. So I was literally on the streets arguing for the closing of the World Bank. And if I might, I would say that this statement by Alan Berg is exactly why. And what we were arguing was that the focus was so much on growth in GDP that we were seeing all over the world cutbacks in health and education expenditures. And at the time in '94, we were mostly arguing that there should be more health and education expenditures for moral reasons. But now I think that we can take this argument in a completely different direction because of changes now in availability of data and the ability to do computation. But Alan's work was really, really important because he was definitely swimming upstream. Now, if you look at his impact at the bank, because of his work, the bank at one point, by around 1990, 95, I'd say, Alan, we'd spend about $1.7 billion on nutrition, which was more than any other organization combined. Is that right, as far as you remember? And it was his influence that did that. But still, there was this strong sense inside the World Bank Group that investing in nutrition, investing in human beings more generally, were things that were the consequence of economic development, not the drivers of economic development. Now, there's some heroic figures and people who were great staff members. In 1949, a bank vice president named Robert Garner, who later became the first president, CEO of IFC, our private sector arm, visited Colombia, and Colombia presented a very balanced proposal that was about half investment in infrastructure and about half investment in health and education. And his response, and I quote, he said, "Damn it, we can't go messing around with education and health. We're a bank." he later was to say, in a few years later, we believe we can most effectively assist our member countries to develop new resources of wealth and income, which would enable them to provide out of their own resources better municipal services, better housing, better health and education. In fact, all the fruits of greater economic productivity. In other words, this was the clearest enunciation that first you get rich and then you invest in your people. So again, you know, around this time in 1990, well, I mean, around the time that I was protesting against the World Bank came out with this document, the Investing in Health Report. And it made the case very clearly that investing in health is a good investment. But I have to tell you, and you know, Keith was involved at that time, there still wasn't the sense that investments in health were on par with, say, investments in roads or electricity. And there exists a fundamental, what's the right word, tendency maybe in the world today, certainly among heads of state and ministers of finance, but also among our own staff, that you know, when you have money from the World Bank, you should really focus it on things that will prepare a country, for example, for industrialization. You know, getting the grid put in place, putting the roads in place. And so this was a very powerful volume. Bill Gates said that this is the most important thing he's ever read, and it got him to think about working in global health. But I think there's still a sense, and the way Keith, our Vice President for HCN, says it is, so many countries will will borrow from the World Bank from IDA, which is our fund for the poorest countries, which is essentially a 40-year maturity at 0% interest, that they'll use IDA funds for health and education, but the minute they graduate to IBRD, which is still, it's 30-year money at 2%, which is still pretty darn good, and certainly not, most of our clients couldn't get 30-year money at 2% on their own on the capital markets. But once they graduate from 40 years at 0 to 30 years at 2, they tend to stop borrowing for health and education. So this is still very much the way we the way we end up doing our work. Sometimes because that's what the countries say. Sometimes because it's our own bias. But there's no question that we have gone further. In 2006, we made the case for nutrition as a central part of development. In 2016, for the first ever investment framework for nutrition, and then the Human Capital Project, which I'll talk to you about in a bit. Now, there's no question that investing in nutrition have an enormous positive economic impact. So if we were to invest the full $7 billion a year that we think is required for nutrition, every dollar invested in preventing stunting would lead to $11 in economic return, so 1 to 11. Every dollar invested to promote breastfeeding leads to $35 in economic return. Every dollar invested to prevent anemia leads to $12 in economic return. And every dollar invested to prevent wasting leads to $4. So all in all, 400 plus billion for benefits for stunting if we had all the money we needed to fight these phenomena. 300 million for breastfeeding, 110 million for anemia, and 25 billion for wasting. So almost over $800 billion, almost $1 trillion of value to the economy if we spent $7 billion to tackle these particular problems. Now, I had the great good fortune of being very involved in global health, and the first, it's a little new technology here, but this is the curve that shows how spending in global health, how available resources for global health have really exploded over the last 30 or 40 years. You know, right in here, this is sort of, right in here is when I really got involved in global health. So literally almost no money for going for global health. And then various programs, you know, President George W. Bush's incredible commitment to tackling HIV, TB, and malaria, the Global Fund, the Gates Foundation, and now we're up at $37 billion or so. But let me just tell you, the most important conclusion you can take from this particular graph is that given the tax structure in the OECD donor countries, given what we're seeing in overall trends, I think it's unrealistic to think that that's going to grow very much, very quickly. It's so important that it has, but I don't think it's going to grow very quickly. And no matter how much it does grow, it won't be enough, because the demand in every developing country is just so high. This is a scene I see every time I go to the field, right? And I've just been talking with the leaders of a group called Singularity University. I think one of the best groups in the world at looking forward and looking and trying to understand the role of technology in the world. And what they told me just over this past weekend is that by 2022 at the earliest and 2025 at the latest, so either 5 to 8 years, the entire global population, 8 billion people, will have access to broadband and will have access to smartphones. So everyone is going to be able to see how everyone else lives. And what that does is pretty specific. And our teams at the World Bank Group have studied this, looking at Gallup surveys and the like. What happens is that overall, when you have access to the internet, people's satisfaction with life goes up. They're seeing things, they're watching movies, they're doing all kinds of things online. But the other thing that happens is that their reference income goes up. The income to which they compare their own and which determines their satisfaction with their own income goes up. And so everywhere in the world, in either 5 or 8 years, I'm betting on 5, everyone will know how everyone else lives, and everyone's aspirations will be going up. And so if we're going to have any chance of meeting those aspirations, the money curve I showed you on global health related to nutrition is not going to be enough. So why is this important? Well, this is the issue that haunts me every day. 155 million children under 5 are stunted worldwide. And we know a lot about what that means now, but just let me give you some of the numbers. And every time I give these numbers per country, it surprises people. 38% of children in Ethiopia, 38% of children in India are stunted, 41% of children in Afghanistan, 43% in Niger, 44% in Laos, 45% in Pakistan, 47% in Guatemala. So in some countries, as much as 50% of the children are stunted. Now, what does that mean? You know, it's really only in the last 10 or 15 years that we've gotten much better data and much better research on what it means. And here's a study from Charles Nelson from Harvard Medical School. The brain on the left is a stunted brain, and the brain on the right is a healthy, cared-for child. So they literally have fewer neuronal connections. And the number, I've heard different numbers, but literally thousands of neuronal connections every minute, every hour, every day, fewer are being made. And these children have as much as 40% less brain volume. And so given that technology is going to wipe out low-skilled jobs everywhere, so our estimates are that in India, some 65% of all jobs will be currently existing jobs will be eliminated by automation. In Ethiopia, that number is 85%. Jobs will be eliminated by automation in every country in the world. And the question is, which of the countries in the world will be able to respond to that by creating new jobs, right? Now, every place I go, the argument for investing in infrastructure is that we have to prepare for industrialization. But Rob Nail from Singularity told me that, you know, well, one of the truisms that you hear all the time is that, well, you know, 3D printing and automation will solve some problems and will dominate some industries, but garments and shoes will always need human hands, right? So Rob told me that the latest innovation that he's seen is you get a program on your smartphone, and when you push the button on the app, you take your foot, your naked foot, and you just run your smartphone around your foot. You push another button, and it sends all that information to a box, which prints your shoe, right? You can now buy suits with no seams. You know, one of the hottest new startups in Boston is a company that 3D prints your suits, right? And you don't need seams because you don't need to start with flat materials. People are not sewing them, they're being printed, right? So what we're seeing is a phenomenon of reshoring. And if you want to see how this is actually working, go to Shenzhen, you're right, very close in Guangdong and very close to Hong Kong. In Shenzhen, they're automating at exactly the speed they need to automate as they lose working population willing to do certain jobs, right? And so it's exactly calibrated to move in a particular direction. But China is investing enormously in robotics and artificial intelligence because they know that this is what's happening. So what are people going to do? Well, it's a big question. The universal basic income discussion is ongoing. But I tell you, I worry about this most. If 38% of Indian children are stunted, and the economy is becoming as digitalized as we think it is, what are they going to do? Because we know from studies of stunted children that they don't learn as well and they don't earn as well going forward. And so my great worry is that the 155 million children in the world are going to become very unhappy because they're going to have smartphones, access to the internet, they're going to see how everyone else lives, but they're not going to be able to compete. Now, we've seen great examples of reductions in childhood stunting. And Peru was one of the great examples that once they finally got serious about it, once we finally, in the World Bank, put money into this project, and once we took a multi-sectoral approach, they dropped their rate of stunting. And I have worked in Peru for years, and it was 28, 29, 30% forever. And it dropped quickly because we took this multi-sectoral approach, changed the incentives, and the rates came down. Senegal is even a better story. I mean, Senegal was able to drop their stunting rates very, very quickly with very strong commitment. Right now, the president of Senegal has continued these reforms, but there was very strong commitment in the government. There was a multi-sectoral strategy, and they provided financing. They borrowed from IDA to do this, and so the sort of lighter colored line is the curve. It went from close to 40% down to below 20% childhood stunting. So we know it's possible, but we actually believe it's possible to do it even faster than that. And in Rwanda, what we're doing is, in light of the fact that so many of the low-skilled industrial agricultural jobs will be eliminated, we're moving now toward professionalizing community health workers. But community social workers, community education workers, Jürgen, community agricultural workers. I mean, I think that we're going to have to think differently about the wage bill in some of these developing countries because they may be the only growth areas going forward. And also what we know is that if we combine training as a community health worker with the soft skills that will help them go on and take other jobs in the formal labor market, that this could be a multiple win-win situation. Because we know from treating tuberculosis for so many years, the way we solved the problem of tuberculosis was we had directly observed treatment. Right? Now, it's not, it would take another form, but there's no reason why you couldn't do directly observed feeding, why you couldn't ensure that every single potentially pregnant woman got good care and good nutrition so that the cycle of intergenerational stunting, which we've seen a lot, is broken. So we actually think, and we're going to try a major experiment in Rwanda, that if you professionalize their right now voluntary community health workers and set the target of going from 38% in Rwanda down to, say, 5% or less, that you could probably do it pretty quickly if you professionalized the community health workers, which we may have to do anyway to create jobs in these countries. Now, we have invested a lot in nutrition. In IDA 17, which is 3 years, 1.9 billion. And in IDA 18, which is this is just the first year, we've already done 1.8 billion. And I don't know where we'll get to, but you know, the World Bank Group will be providing a good chunk of that 7 billion that's needed. And we're going to continue to push it. But the issue is that no amount of money, no amount of stated political commitment from the part of donors and from good people like you is going to change the picture unless the leaders of every single country take it much more seriously. More on that in just a bit. In terms of financing, we have something called the Global Financing Facility for Every Woman, Every Child, and it's a pretty basic idea. It's the idea that any donation given for the health of women and children should leverage other sources of financing. So it should leverage domestic resource mobilization. It should leverage our own lending. And so that you know, we can tell donors to the Global Financing Facility, if you give us $1, we'll provide the countries with at least 5 in various forms, right? And so that kind of approach to leveraging the financing we have, we think will be very important. But there's lots of other things beyond nutrition-specific interventions, women's education empowerment, quality reproductive and health services, quality, diverse, and affordable food, water, and all these things, safety nets. These are all very important, and they're all very important if you're serious about actually changing outcomes. Right? We cannot settle anymore for people going to meetings and declaring their commitment to nutrition, to going to meetings and saying we're going to give a higher percentage of the budget for nutrition. We have to hold everybody, and ourselves included, accountable for actual outcomes. Now, in the area of agriculture, the food system, I think, can have a huge impact. So the food system, if we intervene effectively, can boost incomes, empower women, provide better diets for people. Also, the policies matter. I mean, if you were to ask, what are the let's say we set a goal that every child, there'll be no stunted children, that every child will have a quality education, that every person on earth will have an equal opportunity to compete in the economy of the future. You might ask, well, where's that money going to come from? We have ideas, right? So the first is you may start finally collecting taxes from rich people. There's so many countries where the only people who pay taxes are the ones who are too weak to refuse to pay taxes. We know that. You might get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, right? Fossil fuel subsidies are extremely regressive. They help the rich far more than the poor, and they also put more carbon in the air. You might apply a tobacco tax. We've had tremendous success with tobacco taxes. Poor people are more likely to quit smoking, and you can take the revenue from tobacco taxes and focus it on, for example, health programs. But agricultural subsidies are another one. There are $500 billion in agricultural subsidies, and we're not against agricultural subsidies. We just think they should be more focused. It's not always the poor who benefit from agricultural subsidies. Sometimes it's the big companies. And so if you took all those things together, we believe there would be more than enough money to end stunting in the world, provide education and healthcare for everybody. There are specifics there. But the other great opportunity is climate-smart agriculture, one that I've been talking about since the very first days of my tenure at the World Bank Group. There's so many things that we can do. There's so many win-win-win situations. Scaling up climate-smart agriculture is going to be an absolute key for sustainable growth and fostering resilience. If there is a 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature by 2030, and there's already enough carbon in the air. Where we're going right now, we're already past 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's possible that we're going to lose huge amounts of our productive capacity. 40% of the present maize cropping in sub-Saharan Africa is being done in areas that will no longer be suitable for cultivation. So this is really important. We're all going to Paris on December 12th and are going to make some major new commitments to moving forward on climate-smart agriculture. But this is such a win-win. We need to push forward. And also, I'm here at IFPRI. How could I not talk about agricultural research? It's extremely important, and for all the reasons that Shenggen mentioned. All right, now let me get to the issue of, so how do we change the ball game? How do we go from a situation in which in health and education, you pretty much have a supply-driven sector, right? And we've heard this directly. I mean, I was just talking with one of our top people in health, and he basically said that many poor countries are gaming the system. They're saying things like, why should we invest in vaccines? If we wait long enough, the donor countries will give us the money because they're afraid of vaccine preventable diseases. And so the way it works right now, and I did this. Look, I did this for 25 years. I thought the answer to solving the global health problem was to go out and get donors to commit to a new thing. And we did, and we went from $4 billion to $37 billion, right? And what we have now is a group of leaders in developing countries who are conditioned to wait. So what's the next project, right? Now, I don't mean to name drop, but I have to tell you this story because it's such an important one for me. I think about 6 months ago, I was having lunch with, of all people, Bono, right? And Bono was saying, what I think we should do is to raise a fund for girls' education. Right? Now, I love Bono. He's responsible for a good chunk of that 4 billion to 37 billion increase. He really, really is. He's one of my great, great heroes. But after watching for 5.5 years, how every new fund falls shorter and shorter and shorter of the overall demand, I said, but Bono, why do you want to let everyone off the hook? It would be great to have more money for girls' education. But then everyone would say, hey, great deal, 4 or 5 billion, a new fund for girls' education. You wouldn't have solved the problem, and it would have let everyone off the hook, because that's what then everyone's going to expect. Oh, we don't have to spend our own money on health and education. Bono will raise another fund for health, for whatever ails us at the time. That's just not going to work. So how do we create an environment where heads of state and ministers of finance can't but help invest more and get more serious about improving outcomes in health and education? Well, I'm reminded of a quote that we've later found out that nobody knows if he actually said this, but it's just such a good quote that I keep using it. And we actually called a Roosevelt scholar at Princeton University, and he said, I have never seen evidence of him actually saying that, but it sounds like him. So good enough for us. So what he is purported to have said is that when he met with a labor leader, the labor leader came in and said, we have no labor laws, we have no protection for unions, we have no collective bargaining, we don't have any kind of basic protections. Roosevelt told the labor leader, those are great ideas, I agree with you, now go out there and make me do it. And the idea, what Roosevelt did was that he liked having people out taking very radical positions so that he could take a position that would move the country forward. I mean, Social Security, FDI, so many things that he did that were revolutionary that would move the world forward, but he could be seen as being a moderate because he's pushing the two sides to get out there and try to force him to do it. Now, an even better story is from, some of you may know, someone who I've gotten to know, a very funny man, Jean-Claude Juncker. And Jean-Claude Juncker said this in 2007 at the height of the Euro crisis. He's very funny, and he's always telling jokes like this. But he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg at the time, and he said, and I quote, look, we all know what to do, but what we don't know is how to get reelected once we've done it. Now, in 2013, he was president of the European Commission, and they asked Jean-Claude, do you still stand by that statement? And he said, well, if I'm being funny, I'd say this. For a long time, we didn't know what to do, and we still didn't get reelected. That's the struggle now. So how do we create an environment which will make it very difficult for heads of state and government and ministers of finance to not invest more in human capital, while at the same time letting them be the good men and women and get reelected? How can we do that? So here's what we're doing. So for the first time this year at the World Bank Group, we're taking human capital into account in doing an assessment of the wealth of nations. So it used to be that we only took into account produced capital. That's like electrical grids, electrical grids, roads, all the things that could potentially contribute to productive capacity. Then a few years ago, we took into account natural capital and trying to bring into the mix the notion that the way you handle your natural resources is a critical part of your overall wealth. And this year, again, literally for the first time, it's kind of hard for me to believe it's the first time, but for the first time, we're taking into account human capital. Human capital is a dark green. And so what you see is from high income, middle income, and low income countries, human capital is a huge part of the overall wealth. Overall, probably 65% of all the wealth that exists in the world. And as you go from high to middle to low, the percentage of overall capital that's human capital goes down. Now, this is the really frightening graph. If you look at it in terms of overall wealth per capita, and you look at high income on the right, again, human capital is a very high percentage of the wealth per capita. And as you go to middle and low income countries, the percentages stay about the same, but the overall wealth, the overall human capital per person drops to almost nothing. So there's a huge amount of catching up that needs to be done. And so a very good friend of mine, and somebody I did my internship and residency together with, Chris Murray, does something called the global burden of disease that some of you may know about. Now, Chris, over 20 years, has turned this into an industry. And what has happened is that because of the much, much greater transparency around health data, frankly led by China, but also, and now everyone has been stepping up and providing detailed data on health outcomes. He's been able to show, provide a picture of the health of nations that's just been stunningly vivid. So, for example, some of you may remember reading in the popular press every once in a while, life expectancy in the United States varies 20 years from one part of the state to another. That's all from the Global Burden of Disease study. And what I learned from Chris is that the reason this is so powerful is because he's not doing the classic economic analysis where you take one factor and then you do a regression with another factor. He's actually using Bayesian methods, the methods that Google uses to search, the methods that Jack Ma at Alibaba uses to do all the things that he does. Bayesian methods require a huge amount of computing power, but because he's working at the University of Washington with the Gates Foundation, and because computing capacity has gone down in price so much, he's able to use these very sophisticated methods to look at relationships in health data. So what I asked him was, could you take health data and educational data and then give me an idea of how important the improvements in health and education outcomes have been for economic growth? So in other words, we're not looking at inputs anymore. It's not you can't do better in this analysis if you commit to putting more of your budget. You have to actually get better outcomes. So he took these three factors, which is average years of completed schooling. So we did give them credit for the number of years kids were in school. We're developing something now called learning adjusted years of schooling, because what we know is that just the number of years in school in terms of learning outcomes varies tremendously across countries and even within countries. So average years of schooling, but then also average standardized test scores for math, reading, and science. So there's much, much more data now on testing outcomes. So now, it's not just years of schooling. It's important, but it's now also standardized outcomes. And then physical and mental health in the population age of 20 to 64 using the global burden of disease data. And this is what we found, which was absolutely stunning to me. Our chief economist, Paul Romer, is very famous for coming up with something called the endogenous theory of economic growth. And he couldn't believe these numbers when we saw them. So on the far right is the top quartile of human capital improvers. In other words, the biggest green bar is the group of countries that improved human capital the most over the past 25 years. And the tiniest green bar is the quartile of countries that improved human capital the least. Right? Now, the difference in economic growth looking back 25 years, the difference between the top quartile of improvers of human capital and the bottom quartile of improvers of human capital was 1.25% of GDP per year for 25 years. Among the strongest correlations to economic growth we've ever seen. So we're raising the question and saying, gee, was Amartya Sen right when he said that investments in health and education are the most important determiners of economic competitiveness later? Well, Amartya sure thinks so. Was Paul Romer, our own chief economist, right when he talked about the importance of endogenous factors in determining productivity and economic growth? We are going to take this and we're going to actually create a ranking. And if any of you know anything about our doing business ranking, it's my biggest headache every year. Because every year we put the ranking out. And I think it's one of the most important tools we've ever put out, because over the past, I think now 11 or 12 years, 3,811 reforms have been made by countries trying to improve their doing business ranking. But the ones who are ranked high love it. It's all in all their newspapers. The ones that rank low scream and yell at us and critique our methodology, right? So ranking is inherently a complicated issue, but I don't know of another way to bring the attention of the heads of state and the ministers of finance more clearly into focus. If we just put the numbers out and didn't do the ranking, I think nobody would pay attention. I've asked the people at Standard & Poor's, if we can show you that our calculations are in fact done rigorously, and do give you a sense of potential economic growth. Because if you look back 25 years and you look forward 5 years, the next 5 years will surely put a higher premium on human capital than the last 25 years. So if it was that powerful going back 25 years, how powerful will it be going forward? And we're going to do some estimations. And so the Standard & Poor's people told me, absolutely, we would have to change the way we do our bond ratings based on the human capital index, right? So if you raise somebody's overnight borrowing costs, it gets their attention, I'll tell you. Now, I'm not saying I want to do this. What I'm saying is I have a moral responsibility to make this data real for every one of our clients. Because I feel a huge sense of responsibility to prepare our clients for the economy of the future, right? I'm sorry, I don't think every country in Africa is going to become industrialized the way South Korea was. Everywhere I go, they say, we love the South Korea story. All you had was people and agriculture, and now you're this industrialized country. That's what we want. With automation, with artificial intelligence, with robotics, I just don't think that's going to be on the table for a lot of countries. And so I think this is an absolute emergency. Every country has to feel a sense of what's the right word, just enormous urgency to invest more and more effectively in their people. So how do you do that? Well, my greatest lesson is from someone who I hope you know, and Alan, I hope you know who this is. Julius Richmond. All right, so Julius Richmond, how many people who know who this is? How many people have ever heard of Head Start, the most important nutrition program? This is the founder of Head Start, right? And he was in the Kennedy administration. He worked with Sergeant Shriver, and he's the one who started Head Start, which was a revolutionary both nutrition and early childhood development program in the United States, probably one of the most successful programs, and also the neighborhood health clinics, which turned into the community health clinics. He is a hero, but he's also my teacher and a mentor. And he explained to me that if you want to get anything done in policy, so the story of Head Start is that what he did, he and Sergeant Shriver, before anyone realized what they were doing, had 700 children on the Head Start, 700,000 children on the Head Start program. So even when the rest of the administration learned about Head Start and began to understand what the financial implications were, the 700,000 kids were already on treatment, so they couldn't turn backwards. So he told me, if you want to make changes like that, here's how you do it. First of all, to change public policy, you have to have a knowledge base, you have to have political will, and the most important thing, and he told me the thing that people forget, is social strategy. So his social strategy was to get people on this program, 700,000 people, kids, and at that point, it would have to be taking those kids off the program and then denying other kids the access to the program. The social strategy was key. Julie passed away a few years ago, but I still use this as my own sort of heuristic in thinking about how we can change the situation. So I think that the goal that we all have to embrace now is equality of opportunity. President Xi Jinping at Davos in January of this year made a very powerful statement. At one part of his speech, he said, I'm the head of the largest communist party in the world. In another part of his speech, he said, I'm here to tell you that the global market system is the ocean we all swim in. Any effort to stop the flow of trade, people, ideas, and capital will fail. We cannot go back and turn this ocean into lakes and streams. That's what he said, right? So he didn't say that as head of the largest communist party in the world, we think the right answer is to create equality of outcomes for everybody, right? So China has moved beyond creating equality of outcomes, and I heard his speech as saying that now the thing we all have to commit to is equality of opportunity. And you cannot have equality of opportunity if children are not appropriately nourished. That's the beginning of equality of opportunity. So, same thing. On a foundation of human solidarity, the foundation of which some might argue are eroding, on a foundation of human solidarity with the goal of creating equality of opportunity, we start with a knowledge base. And the knowledge base is all that you've done in the world of nutrition about how you can improve nutritional outcomes. But it's also now, which will be part of the knowledge base, is in October in Bali at the annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF, we will launch the Human Capital ranking system, the Human Capital Index. And this ranking system will reveal to everybody where they sit among 150 countries or so in terms of the quality of their stock of human capital. There's two parts, stock and flow. Flow is how quickly are you improving your human capital. So you can get credit even if you have your stock of human capital is not very good, you can get a lot of credit for investing early. So we will launch that, and it will become part of the evidence base. It will be a new part of the evidence base. It will be extremely contentious. There will be people very angry at me, but I feel that we have no choice but to reveal that relationship, which we think is very real. Secondly, the social strategy. Social strategy, of course, is that as we reveal this ranking, some countries are going to find themselves ranked below other countries that they've always felt entirely superior to. And what do you think will happen locally in the politics if a very powerful country finds itself ranked lower than another country that they've always looked down upon? Won't be very good, and opposition parties could become very mischievous, but it will become an issue. It will become an issue. You know, the reason that countries don't remove fossil fuel subsidies is because they're worried about taxi drivers and truck drivers clogging the streets and blocking traffic. Well, what if people who are upset about the quality of human capital start blocking the streets instead? Much easier to remove your fossil fuel subsidies and invest in people. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm being too sneaky here, right? But I took a lesson from Julius Richmond. If we're committed to ending poverty and boosting shared prosperity, we have to use every single tool we have on behalf of the poor, not to hurt anybody else. You have to build political will, and again, we think that the social strategy will lead to political will, but I've added an element, which is that you need a financial strategy. You need a financial strategy, and I think, again, for us, it's better tax collection, it's removing fossil fuel subsidies, it's tobacco taxes, it's more focused agricultural subsidies, and it's finally collecting taxes from everybody. Now, that's the Human Capital Project. That's what we're trying to do. And what I'm hoping is that as we announce these rankings, the rush will not be for just more grants. The rush will be, how do we actually improve our outcomes? And that's when I hope I'm going to be driving lots of business to you guys, because that's what you've done. We know so many different ways of improving nutritional outcomes, improving health outcomes, improving educational outcomes. But right now, there's just not that sense of urgency and pressure. Remind you of this, because this is happening right now. Aspirations are going up all over the place, and there's what I think is a great thing. It's great that everybody's aspirations are going up. You know, I was born in 1959 in Korea, a country which at that time was not eligible for World Bank loans. The World Bank had decided that Korea was so hopeless that it couldn't afford to pay back a World Bank loan. It didn't get its first loan until 1963, and that was for a road. But then its next World Bank loan, about 5 years later, was for education. And the people at the World Bank thought the Koreans were crazy. Why would you want a loan for education? Why would you want a loan for education? That is, the words that Keith told me this one, social overhead, right? It was social overhead. It was charity. It was not at the core of what they needed to grow their economy. This is happening. So I leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King, one of my favorite quotes. Martin Luther King had a very, I think, important view on urgency, and he said that when he was in the Birmingham jail, he received a letter from a white moderate. And the white moderate said this to him: all Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it's possible that you're in too great a religious hurry. This is the white moderate to Martin Luther King. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. To which he responded, such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time and a strangely irrational notion that there's something in the flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. I'm here to thank you for the work that all of you have done in nutrition for so many years. The world has not done what it should do in eliminating childhood stunting, eliminating malnutrition. But I hope that working together through this Human Capital Project, through, frankly, us taking a lot of heat for daring to put a ranking system out there, that we will then be able to say that we are the generation that have provided equality of opportunity for every single person on the face of the earth. Thank you very much.